Welcome. Thanks everyone for coming to the 2021 Grimes Lecture. My name is Regan Lance Reitzma. I'm the director of the honors program and the chair of the philosophy department here at King's College, which is up in the northeast corner of Pennsylvania in Wilkes-Barre. It's a Catholic liberal arts college. And the Grimes Lecture is actually an annual event for the honors program, almost invariably co-sponsored by the McGowan Center for Ethics and Social Responsibility. And I'd very much like to thank Bernard Prusak, the director of the Ethics Center, for his support. Also, I'd like to thank the honor students on the Student Advisory Council who helped to choose this year's speaker, Dr. Amy Olberding. More on her in just a moment. And I'd also like to mention that the Grimes is named after Donald Grimes, who was a much admired and much beloved priest, counselor, professor, and administrator for over 30 years at King's before his passing in 2005. So on to today's Grimes lecture, which is titled The Gravity of Trifles, Confucian Manners and Morality. This is an event that's been long in the making. It was supposed to be last year's Grimes lecture, but I think you can guess why that didn't happen. So we're so very happy to have waited, and I'm sure tonight's going to be a great event. In any case, all good things come to those who wait, right? So our speaker tonight is Dr. Amy Olberding. She's the presidential professor of philosophy at the University of Oklahoma. She's the author of the 2019 book, The Wrong of Rudeness, right here, Oxford Press. So no book table this year, but you can, I'm sure, find the book quite easily, The Wrong of Rudeness, which our ethics reading group read and enjoyed very much. She also has published a 2011 book with Routledge called Moral Exemplars in the Analytics. And she's got a few dozen book chapters and articles, journal articles, many of them on ancient Chinese thought. She also does some public philosophy. And again, I was mentioning Amy earlier, a lot of my honor students know her as the person who talks about how boisterous she is online, conversing with other people online about big political issues and so on. So Amy, we're very happy to have you with us tonight. Let me just take a moment to mention the person who's going to respond to Amy's talk tonight is Dr. Katherine Filbert. She's one of King's own. She's an assistant professor here at King's College who specializes in 19th and 20th century continental philosophy and also ancient Chinese philosophy. So this is going to be a wonderful meeting of two people with a deep knowledge in ancient Chinese thought. So it makes for, I think, a really good discussion. Before we get started, just note that this is recorded. This event is recorded, and if you have registered for the event, you'll be sent a link of the recording. It also will show up probably by tomorrow morning on the McGowan Ethics Center's Facebook page. So, all right. So one little bit of nuts and bolts here is that before I turn to Amy and let her get going, Amy's going to talk for 45, 30 minutes or so, and then Catherine's going to respond, and then they'll interact a little bit. But you'll also have a chance as an audience to participate too. There will be a Q&A. To participate in the Q&A, what you need to use is the chat function, which you can find down at the bottom of your screen. And please send your questions and comments to me, Regan Reitzma. And so if you send them to me, I will try to make sure I will do the hardest work I can to make sure your question ends up getting asked and your voice is represented, in our Q&A. So with that, we're just going to turn to the event. And Amy, why don't you take it away?
Okay, thank you. And I wanted to thank Regan for inviting me and for hanging in there as we took a year to work out how this would eventually work, as well as to thank Katherine for preparing remarks in response to what I'll talk about. What I want to mainly focus on in this talk is why we might want to get preoccupied and pay more moral attention to issues that we typically associate with good manners, including civility, but also including etiquette. The philosopher Joel Kupperman talks a little bit about a contrast between Western philosophy and Chinese philosophy. And one of the ways he speaks of it is to say that a lot of Western philosophy is preoccupied with what he thinks of as big moment ethics. And he describes this in terms of bringing moral dilemmas into tension with high stakes moral problems as a kind of focal point. If you're familiar with things like trolley problems and so forth, these would be kind of paradigmatic examples of the kind of thing that he's talking about. But arguably, you could say that there is a kind of drama and tension worked even into the early days of Western lineage philosophy, insofar as Socrates is one of the first and most pronounced exemplars of what a philosopher is in Western philosophical tradition. He's notable in part because of his death and because of how he faces his trial, the way he conducts himself, and the choices he makes in an incredibly dramatic, intense situation. But I want to talk tonight about a kind of alternative model. I mean, one of the more striking things when you look at early Confucianism and look through some of the texts, in particular the Analects, which is a text that most vividly depicts Confucius himself, he too stands as an exemplar in his tradition. So if Socrates is the father of Western philosophy, so to speak, Confucius would be understood as the father of Chinese philosophy, and indubitably so. But Confucius as an exemplar is quite different. He's depicted as, certainly he's brave and physically courageous. He also, like Socrates, faces danger in terms of advocating for his ideas. But the text of the Analects really doesn't make much of this. In other words, if you look at the full complement of things that are said about Confucius, the moments where he's in danger and standing by principle and so forth are vanishingly small. Much more time is devoted to talking about Confucius's everyday manners, that he is a well-mannered person, so that we find out more, for example, about his physical posture in various situations, his mode of greeting people, the way in which he dines, how he interacts with friends versus lords versus people who are in mourning. And those kinds of small everyday details form a much more vivid picture of what Confucius is like. And presumably because they do take up so much more of the text, they are the kind of thing that the authors of the text are suggesting we should admire about Confucius. So in a sense, you can look at the text of the Analects and say that the authors are saying, yeah, he's brave and all that stuff, but really, he's actually polite, right? This is given much more attention. And I want to explore a little bit tonight about why, because it is indeed the case that in much of early Chinese philosophy, while there is, still a certain admiration for physical courage and for someone who sticks to their guns, so to speak, concerning their values, a lot of time is given over to what we might think of as very low stakes human interaction, the way that in which we are polite and well-mannered with each other. So initially, to make sense of this, I want to just put out as a kind of premise about on which all of this rests, a premise about what it means to be a human being in early Confucian tradition, so that the account of manners, why manners are so morally important, is rooted in an understanding of what it means to be a human being. Now, that understanding includes most basically that we are fundamentally social creatures. So the early Confucian texts are taking it as a premise that we initially in the world are dependent on other human beings just for our simple survival, that it is the efforts of others that carry us through early childhood, that model for us what it means to be a human being. But we also have ongoing dependencies. So throughout our lives, much of the good that we will enjoy and the harms that we can avoid is going to owe to the efforts of others, so that we will be indebted to both our community as it presently exists, as well as to generations past who have brought us to the point that we currently enjoy. Indeed, in a situation like this, we can recognize that all of us here able to engage in intellectual activity together at great distances from each other, it's only possible because of generations of other human beings who have, created the technology, the electrical grid, even the chairs that we're sitting on, and enabling us to do this. So the human being in the Confucian construction is really emphatically recognized as a social creature. And in accord with that, to understand what it means to flourish as a human being is to flourish with and among other people, so that there is a sense in which my well-being is not something that can be easily or readily separated, either conceptually or experientially, from the well-being of myriad other people, most proximately people like family and friends and so forth, but also in terms of my community, right? So if I will flourish as a human being, it is going to matter to my flourishing that others flourish with me, that in effect we flourish together. Now, the reason that good manners are so important in a Confucian context has exactly to do with this understanding of the person, where we understand ourselves to exist in dependency on others and to derive our flourishing from the structure and cooperation we can achieve with other people. We're going to want those relationships to go well, or minimally, we're going to want to avoid having them go badly. So we can understand the Confucian account of manners in its ambitious formulation as a way to achieve human flourishing, a way to live well in a way that is most distinctively human. But there is also a kind of protective function that it serves. So more modestly, we would say one of the things that manners does is it avoids the kinds of losses that we would suffer if our dependencies fracture and become fractious. So that if we cannot depend on each other, or if we cannot readily cooperate, we will suffer both in material terms, but also in terms of our basic humanity. So one way to get at how all of this bears on the way that we think about small gestures, such as those that are contained in good manners, is to simply think about an example. And most of what I'm going to emphasize, instead of looking at Confucius, I want to look at Xunzi, who is a somewhat later Confucian, because he's most worried about what happens if we don't take care of our manners. In other words, he's not on as much on the optimistic side. He's more on the here's what it's going to protect us against. Because I think that in some respects, in our current cultural environment, that is the more salient issue. So we can use an example, and I borrow this example from the philosopher Karen Storr, who talks about the way in which a Western understanding of manners can be brought to bear on thinking about just how a coffee shop works. And she talks about it in terms of line formation, right? That when we enter a coffee shop and we're seeking coffee, we expect people to line up and to wait their turn in order to have coffee. Should someone come into the coffee shop and break in line, we're going to find that wrong, right? We find that that's a violation. And Storr explains that the kind of violation that it is it's a violation of what we think of as the equality of all people. So that we might say something like, he thinks he's better than everyone else, that he's more important than anyone else. That's why he thinks he can break in line ahead of all of these other people. That's a kind of standard and somewhat Kantian understanding of how a coffee shop line works. By forming a line, we're signaling to each other that we treat each human being as equal. The Confucians would agree that something like respecting persons is important, but they would more likely prioritize not respect for each person as individually equal, but respect for community and the dependencies that we have. In other words, our sociality and our need for each other. So let me think about the way in which we might produce an analysis of a coffee shop rooted in a Confucian sensibility. If we use Xunzi to analyze the way in which a coffee shop line works, one of the things that we most basically recognize is that what's happening in a coffee shop is you have people arriving because they have a desire. They want coffee. Most of them want it right now. Most of them are going to hope that their desires can be fulfilled as quickly as possible. And they're going to be driven by that desire in particular. Xunzi observes that human beings, if they're left just to operate on their desires without any kind of check, they'll quickly devolve into aggression, striving, and contention. So if we don't have a line in a coffee shop and we simply have a melee of, everybody just crushed to the front and, the biggest person will be the one who gets coffee first, we can clearly see that that's an unpleasant state of affairs. Xunzi's broader point, however, is simply that there are desires, impulses, and needs that prompt us. And if we are just left with those promptings, absent any kind of intervention or structure, it will set us into contention, competition, and alienation from other people. Indeed, it is something that can make us think quite low of humanity. However, even though Xunzi contends that our basic nature is bad on account of this unregulated way in which we can operate, he also appears to recognize that human beings do not interact with each other simply as nodes of desire and nodes of competing desire. So it isn't just that I see other human beings as competitors with me or as brutes who are seeking their own good just as I seek my own good. We also have a kind of built-in need for other human beings, right? We are, again, social creatures of a sort. So one of the things that Xunzi appears to recognize is that there's a kind of tension in how we encounter other people. On the one hand, we can recognize that people can really be unlovely, selfish, nasty creatures. I mean, one way to think about what Xunzi is saying is he's just saying, human beings can really be detestable. It's really unpleasant to be around them. But on the other hand, built into our social constitution is a kind of attraction to other people. People are a source and substance of what we value. They're essential both to our survival and to our well-being. When we think of the people that we care about most, we recognize that there's a great attraction in relationships such as friendship and family and so forth. So we have both aversion and attraction in the mix as we interact with human beings. And Xunzi's insight is to recognize that which of these poles, whether attraction or aversion, is going to predominate is going to be influenced and shaped in accord with how we encounter each other. So that if we are exposed to people in ways that present us with their raw desires, their brutish impulses, then we will have an aversion to them. If, on the other hand, we are presented with the possibility of an ornamented or more dignified, more lovely form of humanity, we will find human beings more attractive. So in short, right, how we encounter other people is going to inform whether or not proximity to them generates aversion or permits the development of ethically fruitful attitudes and dispositions toward them. So one of the things that we would recognize is if our flourishing requires other people, we're going to want to engineer our social environments to support fruitful sociality with other people. So back to the coffee shop. In thinking about line formation, one way to understand what's wrong with a line breaker is to say he thinks he's better than everyone else. But there's an alternative way to understand what is going wrong in the coffee shop, and you may have had this response yourself before. Someone breaks in line and your response is, what is wrong with people today? That question, that form of outrage better captures the kind of concern that Xunzi and by extension many of the Confucians have. In saying what's wrong with people today, we're signaling that the import of what the line breaker does is something that immediately leaves us alienated from other people. It can make us more inclined to a kind of brutishness ourselves. And most of all, the rudeness doesn't stay easily contained. It's not very bounded in its effects. So that the line breaker is negatively influencing our attitude toward people in general or toward humanity writ large. So one way is to think about this is It's entirely possible that you can go to the coffee shop and leave not just with coffee, but with misanthropy, where you just hate human beings because of the way that encounter was structured, the messages that it sends to you about what human beings are like. So ultimately, the way that Shunzi presents good manners, right? Why do we not break in line and so forth, has to do with signaling to other people that we are willing to cooperate, to engage in shared spaces, to take our turn, to be considerate of others, to be respectful of their needs as well as our own. These are all communicative signals that are sent by well-mannered conduct. They say something to other people about what kind of social partners we will be. And it is hoped we will thereby signal to others that they can have confidence in community, that they can have confidence in the possibility of human cooperation, and so forth. At a kind of broader level, if we go beyond things like phenomena like the coffee shop, one of the things that we can say about the trifles, right, the everyday, prosaic, mundane kinds of experiences that the Confucians are preoccupied with, is that it's an effort to capture the way in which our practices effectively, formatively structure for us an understanding of what human beings are, and a desire to structure those the best way possible to favor respect and cooperation. So one way to think about this and put it into a contemporary idiom is just to realize that our social encounters with other people often have what we might think of as atmospherics, right? That there's a kind of texture to experience. And it is those textures that are concerning Shunzi and the Confucians. So for example, when we talk about micro-messaging is the way in which when we're communicating with someone, our tone of voice, posture, facial expression, the kind of gestures we make, how our eyes are directed, all of that sends messages and communicates attitudes to other people. We all recognize this intuitively when we think about experiences like apologies. There's a very big difference between saying, I'm sorry, and saying, I'm sorry, right? The inflection changes it entirely. So the kinds of small aspects of experience that Shunzi is concerned with have to do with all of those tiny messages that we are continually sending each other when we're in social environments, and trying to optimize those to favor a vision of humanity that is ennobled by an ability to cooperate and recognize our social dependencies and so forth. Shunzi puts this in terms of, he uses analogies that have to do with texture and odor. He says, right, that when we are in social environments, we are going to be influenced by what we rub up against. So that he acknowledges that social contact with other people, it can be smooth as silk, it can be abrasive like sandpaper. And some of our experiences are going to be effectively sanding away or rubbing away at our confidence in shared humanity with other people. And those are exactly the situations that we have to worry about. Likewise, he talks about a plant that if you soak it in foul water, even though it has beautiful smelling flowers, it begins to stink because it takes on what it is soaked in. So too, human beings in their social environments take on the kinds of attitudes about humanity in which they are soaked. Now, one promising contemporary application to this kind of thinking about the impact and the moral import of manners, I think, can be fruitfully applied to issues such as micro inequities. We have come to speak more recently about the way in which there are small gestures that can be inflected toward racialized biases, toward biases of class, sexism, and so forth. And our understanding of these has grown more sophisticated to acknowledge that there can be very small gestures that speak volumes. And the Confucians, in effect, have a way to analyze the import of these. So I want to give one kind of example of these. The philosopher George Yancey talks about the elevator effect. And what he is describing there is how, as a Black man, he experiences being in an elevator car with a white woman. And he says, that typically her body posture will tense up. She'll grab her bag a little more closely. She'll refuse to make eye contact. And he reads this as a racialized experience in which he is symbolically cast as a kind of threat, a potential threat to her, or even an actual threat that necessitates something like clasping her bag more tightly. When we think about that kind of experience and try to cast it in the framework that Xunzi is suggesting, one of the things that we can say in analysis of it is that those small gestures taken cumulatively are not so small. So that if we think about the way in which our social encounters can oblige us to rub up against racism, biases, classism, and so forth, or the way in which we can just simply rub up against experiences, communities that are not receptive to us as belonging, that those sand away at our ability to maintain confidence, both that we belong in community and that we can fruitfully cooperate with others. Right? What Xunzi is worried about is that we retract from our dependencies and our participation with other people in the formation of community. And one of the things that he is at pains to try to convey is that our willingness to do all of that is often not a matter of what abstract commitments we may have or of what we think at leisure about what human beings are like. Instead, it's going to be formed through what our experience of human practices convey. If what we see in our environment are other human beings who are engaged in considerate, respectful, tolerant conduct with each other, we are more likely to see them as social partners with whom we can engage. This is why Xunzi speaks of manners as a kind of ornamentation. Our raw nature, our basic impulses are pretty brute, but we in effect restrain them, we regulate them, and we control them with good manners in order to facilitate the kind of flourishing that is possible in community. And I will leave it at that and shift to the discussion with Katherine.
Well, thank you. To reiterate Regan's welcome, thank you again for being here with us in digital community. We're really glad that we could make this event happen, especially after having to postpone it last year. I want to thank you for your talk here tonight, but I also want to thank you for your work in general that lies behind the talk you've given to us tonight. As someone who works in early Chinese philosophy, it's really encouraging to hear from someone who has not only been a public defender of the importance of non-Western philosophy, but who has such a keen sense for the significance of the tiny details and practices and not just abstract moral theory that we find in Chinese philosophy. You present us with what I think are two challenges that speak pretty loudly to our current times, and I think we would probably do well to hear. The first concerns how we think about and embody the big pro-social values that guide our lives together, and the difference between what you're presenting to us as a kind of respect or equality or Kantian model and a kind of Confucian dependency model. I'm reminded of an article that I read in The Atlantic in 2019, where the journalist Adam Sewer argued that there are two senses of civility. He said the first is tantamount to something like, don't be a jerk. And the second is a much baser claim, which is something like, I can say whatever I want and you can't do anything about it. He argues that we wind up conflating these two, and it kind of poisons the discourse of civility, turning it reactionary. But it's not hard to see that both of those belong to the same model, right? That abstract liberal model where respect and tolerance are like lines that we're not supposed to cross so that we can maintain our coexistence. and everybody can equally pursue their own good. Right? We're all familiar with the saying that good fences make good neighbors. But this can easily slide then into a notion that to vocalize a disagreement or to offer reproach is somehow crossing that line, and that we're now being disrespectful and intolerant by doing that. I think this leads us into a whole mess that we're probably all very familiar with in our present, that rouses hostility and tribalism on the one hand, but also fear and hesitancy to speak up on the other. You're offering us another model of civility, which I hope maybe sidesteps some of that mess. If respect is not rooted in a barrier, but in the wide and inescapable dependencies that constitute the richness of our humanity, then manners and civility are really not a price we pay, but a tool that we use, right, to shape ourselves and also to engineer our social environments to get those goods of shared life. This seems to ask us to shift our thinking about respect from being something that people do or do not deserve, to rather our powers and our own responsibilities for maintaining it in light of our dependencies. I think this provides a deeper tie into our everyday lives, but it certainly requires much more of us than not simply being a jerk. The second challenge that I take you to be raising for us is to reconsider the communicative effects of practices of etiquette. Much of the morally relevant action in our lives occurs at the level of unconscious habit. And this means that we can perpetuate harms while also being at the level of conscious commitment, committed to avoiding those same harms. So I think you're presenting us here a challenge to address not just the direct effects of our individual acts, such as the harms that George Yancey, for instance, accounts his experience in the elevator, but how we can make the world ugly for others. And in doing so, we strain their good faith and their sociality without realizing that we're doing it and that we have a responsibility for it. So this means that the moral arena is a lot more prosaic and a lot more common and small than we might realize. And I think this is a really deeply sobering thought for us in our present atmosphere. Now, civility and manners discourse is not without its problems. And I imagine that there are people here who might want to talk about when rudeness or incivility might be called for. But I want to leave that space open for others to ask those questions. Instead, I'd like to formulate 3 questions from the position of somebody who would want to be committed, who gets what Shunzi is saying and wants to take on those challenges. So my first question concerns what we can do when we find maybe ambivalences in our practices of etiquette, where what is being communicated seems problematic or mixed in its messaging. This is a question that's inspired by my insightful students here at King's. When I teach the analytics, I give them an assignment and I ask them to think about forgotten or lost li, so practices of etiquette that have fallen by the wayside. And invariably, they bring up gendered forms of etiquette and manners. Both men and women in the class talk about practices like men going out of their way to open doors for women, coming to the front door rather than just texting to pick them up for a date, putting on good airs to impress dad, or even walking on the street side of the sidewalk, which is, I guess, so that they will get hit by a car and not their date. And some students, think these are good that they're gone. Some wish that they were back, but a lot of the students are actually internally conflicted about this. They see that the practices seem to express respect and consideration, which is good, but also acknowledge, as feminist theorists like Marilyn Frye pointed out to us, many decades ago, that these express contempt towards women. So the students both want to perform these mannerly practices and also don't want to perform them. So my question is, given the kind of Confucian trust in the good work that civility and manners and etiquette does, what might we do in response to etiquette practices that have that kind of ambivalence concerning the value that they're scripting or expressing? My second question, I think, follows from that first question. And it has to do with the desire to call people out for harms or injustices or bad behavior. I'm thinking of the student who maybe wants to reply to somebody holding the door open for her with a kind of snarky, what do you think, women can't hold open doors for themselves? Or maybe the person in your coffee shop who wants to call out the person breaking the line. And they might even be applauded for doing so. or somebody in that elevator who might be witnessing those kinds of micro inequities occurring and wants to speak up because they see it happening. Now, the analects tell us that when we encounter someone exemplary, we should seek to emulate them. And when we encounter somebody being base or petty, we should check ourselves, right? We should reflect on our own behavior. They also advise that we should redress badness by focusing on our own bad qualities and not those of others. But if we wanted to do precisely that, is there a Confucian approach to, say, calling out somebody or talking about the bad behavior that somebody has committed, while also being committed to giving mannerly signals that we want to cooperate and that we want to guard those shared big values? My last question concerns the kind of the weight of all of this. I think it's probably not a stretch to say that this past year has been taxing and has put a strain on our sociality. I have become profoundly aware of the many dependencies, both the kind of transactional functional dependencies of people who sell me groceries and bring the gas to the gas station so that I can fill my car with gas. But I think many of us have experienced that increasing aversion towards others that maybe tips towards cynicism and the misanthropy that Shunzi reminds us of. And I think for some of us, this can be a temptation to want to kind of tap out and retreat to our tribe and our silo and our people and just kind of, forget everything else. It's hard to even talk to neighbors sometimes these days. So remaining committed to practicing manners and etiquette and civility maybe seems like we're potentially setting ourselves up for a kind of failure or a despondency when it's not returned or when it's really difficult. And so while Confucius might hold out the hope that his behavior is going to steer others towards the better, and Shunzi asks us to be confident that we're improving our environment through those acts, I certainly don't expect that I'm going to have that ability to steer other people towards better behaviors. And I wouldn't hitch my wagon to that hope for myself. So I guess my last question is, where might we kind of draw motivation to continue with our commitments to manners and etiquette, while being humble enough to acknowledge that we are very far from exemplary like Shunzi and Confucius were? So thank you for your talk, and I hope somewhere in those three questions you found something that might be worthwhile to respond to.
Yeah, let me say that there's no clean answer to any of them, but say at least a little bit about kind of my thinking about them. With the first one, in terms of ambivalence about the kinds of practices that we have, I mean, I've emphasized kind of the good that manners can do, but if you do take on board the Confucian analysis of what manners are doing, it's also very alarming to recognize that all of these small practices that we have that often are flying under conscious awareness and that are structuring our lives from the time that we're tiny children can be scaffolding all kinds of biases. And so when the practice was that, men opened the door for women and not the other way around, you essentially had this practice that was scaffolding sexism into, the behavior of everyone. And that was just taken as something that was structuring experience. And probably many people, it wasn't a conscious thought, but it's having an effect, right? Because the practice is shaping your idea of humanity. And humanity includes those for whom the door is opened and those who open the door, and all that is entailed in that. I think I don't have a solution for that, but I think that one clear imperative that comes from this is to do something that a lot of Western moral philosophy has not yet done, which is to take our micro practices seriously. So that as long as we do have that sense of big moment ethics where we're focusing on these dilemmas and so forth, we may miss the ways in which, a lot of our attitude and dispositions toward humanity are shaped by practices that we're not even attending to. And I think it amplifies imperatives to try to adjust our practices in more equitable and just directions. And part of how we do that is through, shared negotiation of them. And I think that shared negotiation can take many forms. And I do tend to have the attitude that just as a practical matter in our social environments, where something like door holding, this kind of shifts into the second question about when we signal that wrongs are committed, or that we disapprove, or we want to discourage a particular kind of activity, or we want to condemn. I'm kind of a happy pluralist about that, in the sense that I think that it would be a startling society that could eradicate sort of the real fire starters among us who just want to scorch somebody for a misstep, but that there will also be those who, all they're going to do is just drop their jaw and, and express visibly their reactions to things. But as a more general note, I mean, I think that that's one of the ways our practices change, is that they just, we discuss them. They become a social issue. We converse about them. I mean, most of my students nowadays, if I talk about gendered door holding, they sometimes speak of it like it's just a completely archaic practice. And maybe I just underestimate how old I am, but when I grew up, there were lots of women in my acquaintance who would just walk to a door and just stand there, right? I mean, you just stood and waited until someone grabbed the door and opened it for you. But in terms of how to call people out, I mean, one of the things, and I do talk about that a little bit in the Eon piece that you referenced, I think one of the worries that I have about our current contemporary ways of discussing such things is we often talk about incivility in very martial, masculinized ways, as if it is a form of bravery and a form of combat and a way of triumphing. And I think calling people out has a bit of that to it, right? We're speaking truth to power, and so forth. And so one of the things that I think is useful is just to shift the way that we speak about such things. If we think of it in terms of not calling out someone's wrong, but in terms of the kind of correction that we would issue to someone we care about, right? When a friend makes a misstep, I don't think of it in terms of calling the friend out. I think of it in terms of, signaling my disappointment or my discontent and so forth. So I don't think that we need to have, we don't necessarily need to have those more kind of aggressive ways of formulating what we're trying to do. And I think that would discourage us from being aggressive. And just as a strategic matter, we're more likely to get uptake for correction when it's done in some friendship. I mean, sometimes when someone misspeaks, the best thing, or someone says something offensive, the best thing you can say is, I'm sure I didn't hear that correctly. What did you just say? Right? And most people are drawn up short by such a reaction and will think about what they've said and seek to correct it. In terms of the temptation to retract, I am really with you on that. In terms of other people, I mean, one of the things that I think we do have to grapple with, and this is a challenge that I think just comes with the territory, is, for many of us, we're fine thinking about cooperation and humanity as something that we aspire to, so long as the people we're talking about are my people. I sometimes divide people into three categories: my people, and those people. And for most of us, right, we want my people. People in general can be irritating, and those people are just terrible. We don't get to map our experience that way. I mean, I think one of the things the pandemic should alert us to is, whether we like it or not, we're stuck with each other. I mean, we don't, just as, this is putting it in a more cynical kind of Confucian, Shunzian version, but that we can't individually or just for my people control the pandemic, right? I mean, we really are, our fates are tethered together. And so that I think that that impulse to retract is something that one has to try to resist, even as I recognize that there's not, I think that the Confucians, one of the things I like about them is they don't suggest the motivation for this is easy, right? I mean, sometimes the motivation is just the hope that you can make a little bit of difference somewhere, somehow. And that you're just going to do the best you can with the lot that you get. And that sometimes moral maturity just demands accepting that as what you're left with. And I think in a pandemic, that might be a especially useful way to think, where it's not what any of us want, it's not what any of us would choose, but we got to make the best of it, right? I mean, we've got to do the best we can with what we've got. So I'll leave it at that maybe and see if there are other questions that anybody wants me to take up, or Katherine, if you wanted to follow up.
Yeah, I wanted to say something in response to what you're telling us about Shinza. Made me think of something that it seems helpful. Sometimes when we talk about the way we can commit wrongs to people, we get torn between the intention behind doing it and the reception. And that can make the conversation really uncomfortable and difficult. And I'm hearing in your idea from Shinza that the way we treat others will perfume and color and create an atmosphere that we're responsible for. And I think that maybe helps point us towards the gap between intention and reception, and that it's not just simply a matter of what we're intending, but how it's being received. And it's clearly a much larger moral burden than I think a lot of us are often think we have, or even kind of willing to take on. So.
Yeah, I definitely think that, I mean, that's one of the things that, knowing that I'm virtuous and have the right dispositions doesn't go far on this model, because you want other people to be able to know that. I mean, if I, intend to be compassionate towards someone or apologetic, I want them to know that, and manners are a way to communicate. So if I'm failing at that, if it's not well received, minimally, I want to try to sort that out. And I think that this goes back to what I was saying at the very beginning, where in the Analects, you have this tiny amount of attention given to Confucius being, brave in hard circumstances, but all this attention being given to how well-mannered he is. If you think about the difficulty of communicating effectively and how frequently you're on the clock where being well-mannered is concerned and giving pro-social signals, it's hard. I mean, arguably, what Confucius is doing in maintaining himself as a well-mannered person is, is a form of heroism, right? Because it requires a kind of very persistent effort to train oneself to have the right kinds of habits, to be an able communicator, and to be perceptive about other people's reactions and about one's own context.
Well, thank you for your responses.
Mm-hmm.
I'll take that little pause there after a rich discussion to be a signal that maybe it's time to drop some questions from the crowd. There's an initial little bit of quietness, and also now there's a flurry. So I'm going to try to pull things in from a number of people. One question that's kind of come up, I think, from two people has to do, I guess, what you might say, of how deep the hope is in the Confucian tradition for, if we do resolve to aim to be civil very consistently in our everyday lives, how deep will be shaped by that? Is it largely a process of managing the misanthropy that's deep within, the troublesome, unruly desires that pop up to be rude and so on? Is it just a management project, or is it one that has real hope for serious transformation of our hearts?
In whether we look at Shinza or in the Analects, it is meant to be a transformative project, so that the I mean, Xunzi, because he is the kind of darker Confucian, you know, does have an emphasis on that. But one of the things that's striking is that, I mean, he's effectively, I mean, one way to think about him is that, you know, while he starts with this dark picture, he has this sense of like, we can be completely transformed, right? I mean, in effect, we can sacralize our own humanity by how we operate in community. And that at an individual level, the idea here is that through my practice of ritual or etiquette, good manners, right, the whole complement, that I am self-consciously shaping my moral consciousness, right? So, I mean, one way to think about this is to think about the practices and our attitudes as in a kind of feedback loop. So we can think about this with a simple example like gratitude, so that one way that gratitude can transpire is I receive something, I feel very grateful for it, and then I communicate that gratitude in a well-mannered, appropriate way. But that's not the only way it can happen. It can also be the case that I receive something and I express the, you know, ritually, mannerly appropriate gratitude, and that brings the feeling along. This is why we tell little children to say thank you repetitively, is not because we want them to follow a script, but because we think that they need to learn to appreciate the beneficence of others. And so when we're telling them to say thank you, we are calling their attention to the beneficence of others. We're scripting a way of speaking that is that will inculcate attitudes and dispositions in them. And that's part of just ordinary human development. But the Confucian picture here is that a kind of lifetime of that is pursued in a devoted way will transform one's own, you know, psychology in effect. This is why you have, you know, Kongzi is depicted as, you know, in part why he's depicted as joyful. It's also part of why he's depicted as, you know, sort of never overstepping, because he has this sensitivity to other human beings. And it's a kind of transformation. And even for Xunzi, you know, enough practice and enough structure and cultivation of our behavioral habits and so forth, and we will be psychologically and dispositionally transformed by it, and we will have a different sense of humanity.
Great. I want to especially catch a couple of questions from students that are coming in. One question has to do with clarifying the distinction between the Kantian model, respect model, and the Confucian relational model, dependency model. Is there a really striking way to get at the nub of that? That really, is there something that how they come apart? They prescribe something different. There's a question about can we kind of get at that distinction and make it as stark as possible?
Oh, well, I'm not too fond of trying to. I don't want to make it artificially stark, as if there is this bifurcated, you know, here's Kant and here's the Confucians, because I think that Kant and the Confucians probably would have gotten along in a lot of ways. You know, Kant has a very long treatment of how to have a dinner party. And a lot of what he says, I think a Confucian would be sympathetic to. I mean, I could see the Confucians attending Kant's dinner party. And thinking that his meticulous attention to how it goes would be useful. So I don't want to separate them too much. But one way to think about it is to think about where the wrong is attaching. So that when I am rude to someone, or when I'm just rude, we can think of it as a harm that attaches to a person, in that I disrespect the person, right? That I treat them as not equal to myself, that I affront their dignity. And that's a more Kantian tilting way of understanding it. Whereas the Confucian harm is going to be a harm that's less conceptualized as a harm to individuals than a harm to us together, to the possible us, to the community we could be. That's one way of thinking of the difference. There are myriad other ways that we could discuss this. I mean, Kant's conception of the human being as an autonomous individual is not something that maps well onto the Confucian picture, but that's a kind of deeper issue. I mean, in other words, the premise underneath the Confucian treatment is not one that Kant would appear to endorse. So that's another level of difficulty.
There's also a question, I'm going to read this one. Would the Chinese philosophers suggest we have a responsibility to accommodate people who are uncomfortable around other people? And then this is kind of even striking. Do we have an obligation to bring folks who are uncomfortable in social situations out of their shells, as it were, to engage them in more social interaction? So this ties maybe what Katherine was worried about, right? If you make it a kind of a part of my job and being civil to make people better, oh, what a responsibility. And I'm not sure how often I'll be able to be effective. So if there are people who, given this, we're social creatures, we're highly dependent. Some people struggle to operate in social environments. Does Lee include does the practice of civility include again, an obligation, as the way the person puts it, to bring such folks out of their shells?
I do think that there would be an understanding that we would need to be responsive to other people's discomfort, and make efforts to make them comfortable. I mean, one of the things that I think is implied in all of this is that if you look at an etiquette manual, just a kind of standard etiquette manual, you will find that there are all kinds of rules and guidelines and so forth that you can follow. But it's also the case that there is no set of rules and guidelines that's going to navigate every conversation, every social situation, and so forth, right? So that human experience is simply too complex for us to have a rule book. And so some of what being well-mannered entails is having good practical judgment and a kind of attentive perception in social environments. In other words, it would be very challenging to be well-mannered if you're not attending closely to the people in your social situation. And so I think that someone who is well-mannered in the sense the Confucians attend is going to be far more likely to notice someone else's discomfort, right? And to try to put that person at ease, or to try to encourage them toward comfort in a way that, at least in the idealized Confucian picture, would be masterful, right? I mean, a way of drawing them in and so forth. And so I do think that there is an imperative of sorts toward that, but it would all be contextually sensitive, because there are also, I think, clearly times when the well-mannered thing is to leave someone alone. And that would be perfectly consistent with some of the thinking here too.
Katherine, if you ever want to jump in, of course, don't hesitate. I have this happens from a student as well. Is there any Confucian advice for not becoming discouraged when fighting for civility?
I struggle with this, because I think that, one of the things that is striking to me about early Chinese philosophy, or early Confucian philosophy in particular, is that there isn't much about it that sort of starts from the very ground up, that says, what is our motivation? There seems to be a kind of assumption that we are already motivated to, live in a world that permits flourishing and encourages flourishing, and to have some incentive to bring that world into being. Part of that may have to do with the audience for these texts, so that, Kongzi, Confucius, and Xunzi are in some ways, speaking to people like themselves who, would have already had an interest in that direction. But one of the things that I like a great deal about the Analects, in particular as a text, is that it attends to the fact that in his own lifetime, Confucius wasn't much of a success. So, the fact that we're still talking about Confucius 2,500 years later can make us think, impressive, memorable, sage-like figure, but he wasn't recognized as such during his own time. In his own lifetime, he regularly failed to get a position, advising in government. He taught his students, but some of them died young. His own son died young. Some of them, served corrupt rulers and themselves became corrupt. Things didn't go well in his lifetime. And so it's plausible to think that Confucius most likely died thinking that it just didn't work out, that it really, the things he aspired to were not things that were realized in his lifetime. And one of the interesting things about the way that he's depicted in the text is, if you look for it, you will realize that he actually complains quite a bit, right? I mean, that there are passages where Confucius is saying, I should just give it up. One of his students says, what I'd really like to do is just go swim on a spring day. And Confucius's response is, me too, right? While the other ones are talking about their political ambitions. At one point he talks about taking his most brash and somewhat hot-headed student and says, let's just take to the sea on a raft, because he's so discouraged. I think that the picture that you get of why you would keep going in the Analects is at once hard to capture, but very beautifully prosaic in a sense. I mean, sometimes we can have narratives of people who keep going because they believe in some, vast and ambitious ideal, and that there is, is some kingdom to be realized, so to speak, some utopia that we can establish, or, some victory that we will win. And my sense is that with the Analects, it's a much more quiet kind of hope that, I don't much like the world that I live in right now. And because I don't, I'd really like it to be otherwise. And if the choices I make can start shifting it toward otherwise, maybe somebody later can have something better. My favorite sort of comparison for the feel of Confucius that at least I interpret in the Analects is a World War II veteran named Bill Bailey, who was interviewed in Studs Terkel's Oral History of the War. It's a book called The Good War, but it's interviews with ordinary people and how their experience of World War II transpired. Most of it really, just terrible and rough and horrible conditions. And in effect, what you get is that many ordinary people wanted a different kind of life. They are taken up and abducted by events beyond their control, and they try to make the best of it the best they can. And the way that Bill Bailey puts it is, he says, I like to think there's still something like humanity, and 10 years from now, I'm trying to put it the way he does. I'm probably going to blow it. 10 years from now, if they say them poor sons of bitches, they really took a beating, but glory to them. That's what the best I can do, right? And I think that that's in some ways a form of motivation that is very modest. It's not a philosophical account of motivation. It's a way of saying, the world is rough. I wish it weren't so. I'd like it not to be so for someone else, right? Like I want to maintain that thin thread of hope that it could be better than it is right now. And I think that that maps onto the Confucian picture in some ways, at least in the Analects, very nicely, where, you know, why do you keep going? Well, part of why you keep going is you just hope it's going to be otherwise. And the otherwise may not come for me. It may be later, but I want to add my little bit to it, right? And in the hopes it makes some kind of difference. So that's not, as I said, it's not a grand vision, but I think it's a very compelling one.
I agree. There are kind of a series of questions about how to think about certain contexts, like what to think about the ethics of texting and the ethics of well, texting was one of the two things the person was asking about, but that's a good one to start with. Is there something kind of useful to say about you know, doing Lee in 140 characters or less?
How to tweet politely. Yeah, that I don't know. But I think that in terms of texting, not in a Confucian idiom per se, but just in terms of the sensibility recommended by Confucianism, it's just that I think that this is, in some ways, we would say, it's a form of communication, and so the way in which we will structure it is going to be in some ways affiliated with the forms of communication as they have always, or mostly been practiced. So we would want to expect some kind of continuity, so that were we sitting together over tea in the 18th century, it would be startling if I abruptly broke off to take up my quill and write a letter in the middle of our conversation. Perhaps some of those norms would apply here, or the way in which we would expect, a phone call to accept and keep on a phone call for a long time while someone is with you to be a socially dubious activity. So perhaps texting is something like that. It's a way of being less than present with the person who is present and communicating with someone who is not present. That's one way to think about it, and think that that really texting is not really something new in the world. What it is it's communicating with someone who's not present. And then the question is, how should that be managed in terms of people who are present? I don't know if it's going to work that way. I mean, it seems to me that texting while others are present is just something that people have come to do. So we would expect some kind of continuity, but I think this is one of those areas where we have not yet worked that out. I mean, and there's a generational divide in this as well. And I realize even the way that you formulate a text, I'm embarrassed to say I've been texting for a few years now, but I only recently discovered that putting a period at the end of a text to people of a certain age is taken as aggression. So I've written lots of properly punctuated, but I guess aggressive seeming texts. So
I know what you're talking about. I'm only maybe a month into realizing that myself. So,
yeah, who knew, right?
right. I'm going to pick up on one more kind of pop culture question. How to apply what you're having to say about pop culture issues. And I think that this does probably come from someone who's read your Aeon article, which, you're talking in the similar area tonight, but in the Aeon article, you talk about the therapeutic cynicism you engage in. You have these desires to shout people down online, but you start to call into question your own motivations and rationalizations for thinking it's righteous to do so. You're pretty tough on yourself there. And the question kind of is in the direction, if we really kind of followed your pattern of wanting to be very critical and very self-critical for practicing thinking it's righteous to be rude, what if John Oliver adopted your practices of therapeutic cynicism, would he have to leave the air and drop his night job? I mean, it's the kind of, how far does this go? Are there late night television or things like that are full of, what motivates a lot of it is this joy in making fun of and poking fun of the other side. Would that just have to go? Would have to slow it down?
No, I mean, I don't think it would. I mean, certainly not all of it, right? I mean, I think that we can recognize that there's a permissiveness regarding certain kinds of aesthetic forms, and that, satire being one, and certainly, sharp political commentary, and so forth. And where the boundaries are within those forms is something that is constantly under negotiation. Because there is a sense in which we have a, rougher public discourse, but it's also the case that, there were things that you used to be able to say, kinds of jokes you could make that I think now we're pretty collectively agreed that they're not good, right? I mean, so I think that this is one of those areas of social negotiation, in terms of explicit forms such as, political commentary, political satire, and so forth. In terms of the kind of, heated debate and back and forth and so forth, I mean, the reason that I think a kind of therapeutic, concern with self-deception is important is just that, at least at present, it seems to me that we are more likely, and maybe I'm speaking here just as a more hot-tempered person rather than mild-mannered, but I mean, it seems to me that, at least in that piece, what I'm arguing for is restraint, right? That the excesses are more likely to go in one direction than another. And in particular, when we're engaging in interaction at some distance, because the other is not as, real for us, is not as vivid for us. And there are all kinds of now increasing literature on, the psychology of online behavior and the way in which group dynamics and desires to belong and so forth can inform the kind of speech that we engage in. And for myself at least, I think that sense that my perception that I'm doing something in good humor, that I'm doing something in a way that is legitimate and justified, I am just persistently drawn up short by that sense that everyone thinks that, right? And I don't think they're all right. I mean, so that, people will claim, that they are righteous in what they're doing, and I will deeply disagree with that. And so I'm trying to keep in mind that just the potential for self-deception here is great. And so at a personal level, in terms of one's own conduct, setting aside these, certain kinds of aesthetic forms and certain kinds of shared entertainments and shared activities, that at an individual level, I think we can easily just be mistaken about what we're doing. And I'm much more, just to clarify, I'm much more interested in the first person version of this than I am the other. And indeed, everything that I've said tonight is kind of hinging on that idea that I'm not really interested in policing other people's manners. And I think that is not the Confucian orientation, right? Katherine brought this up, right? I mean, it's reflecting back on oneself is persistently emphasized. And so a lot of what I'm saying here is not meant to be a kind of social commentary on the way the world is working, but instead is about, how do I think about the contribution that I make to the social atmosphere?
John Oliver will have to work this out in fear and trembling in his own heart, and maybe he will. So maybe we shall end on one last kind of two-part question, and it's been a wonderful event. there is kind of these pleas coming out, like, a kind of a call for, it really is okay, isn't it, for marginalized people, especially, to punch up, even if it doesn't standardly fit the expectations for civility and the Confucian tradition. There's kind of a, not that they all come in pleas, but there's questions like that, and sometimes they have that kind of form. And a second question, maybe these can be related, is how does Confucianism, the way the question reads is, do you think Confucianism can be thought of as a method or approach to proper behavior rather than a body of traditions and rituals? And then here's the thing I'm really pressing. If so, how does Confucianism allow for progress and innovation in social interaction? And I wonder if those two, leaving the right to punch up might be part of an answer to the second question. How does Confucian tradition allow progress and innovation? So maybe, and Katherine, feel free to jump in at some point again too, as kind of last notes.
Just to start with the second part first, just historically, the Confucians, thought that there were traditions in existence that had gotten it right. And so they were mostly kind of revivalist traditionalists, right? So that there were traditions that they wanted to see sort of reanimated and revived and reinvigorated, and in a sense, re-understood. So historically, not much to say about that. However, I think the sensibility that is articulated here is one that is certainly ripe for thinking about social and moral progress, because one of the things that it's capturing is that there is this profound moral weight to the accumulation of small interactions, right? And that those small interactions form the fabric and texture of experience. And the fabric and texture of experience is how we're understanding what our humanity means. And so the project here, in effect, is, I do think that a lot of our dialogue about civility is just off on the wrong foot. I mean, most popular discourse about civility exists in a particular pattern. Somebody does something, that is eye-popping, and someone critiques its civility, and then people critique the people critiquing the civility, and then we start civility wars about whether civility is really just, stifling people, or what it all means. And we never get anywhere, because it's just these episodic hand-wringing because somebody did something. Real progress would be something where we have a kind of reflective public dialogue about what our practices are, what our practices should be, because you see this even in progressive communities and stuff, where you will have groups, community groups and so forth, where they organize a set of rules about how people are going to interact. And that is just a small scale effort at saying, we need a pro-social form of organization. What should that look like? And that process of reimagining is something that I think is very viable. With respect to marginalized people punching up, I mean, I really, the language of punching, I think, is a problem. Simply because, there is this kind of narrative about what kind of incivility is justified, and you can hear people appealing to the fact that they are punching up as a way of justifying it. One of my concerns is that just simply that you punch too much and too often, and you just cultivate an appetite to punch. I mean, in other words, what our habits are can be self-sustaining. The other thing that I worry about is that not all forms of marginalization are visible. And there are individual levels at which we have to be concerned as well. So I do think that when you have someone who is, who in our social hierarchy in a position that is lower, there is, I certainly find it more sympathetic for someone to use incivility that way. But I also think that it's a mistake to simply say that that's, you know, kind of an automatically justified form of incivility. I mean, one of my concerns is that it's not a form of incivility that's available to everyone. I kind of make that point in that online piece, right? I mean, there are people who don't have access, in effect, to righteous incivility, simply because of how their social identities are read. So, right, I mean, using Yancey's, you know, some in a similar vein to what Yancey suggests, a Black man who is uncivil may be taken as a threat, and the consequences are dire. I mean, it's not clear to me that punching up is available, and really is more egalitarian, because I think that it conceals the way in which not everybody gets to punch at all. And some people punch but won't be perceived as punching, right? So that they'll be perceived as being aggressive, or they'll be perceived as being brutish, or they'll be perceived as being bitchy or hormonal, and all of those sorts of things, right? I mean, our social identities inflect how our incivilities are read. And so it's not clear to me that it's as simple as saying the marginalized can punch up, because I'm not sure that there's a clean way toward that really is more egalitarian.
Well, wonderful. Thanks so much for the wonderful talk. And Katherine, I think, was a superb and subtle response. So the talk was great, the response, and thanks so much for the crowd for all the questions. Again, forgive me if I didn't happen to weave yours in there. I gave it a go. So, you know that the video will be up soon on McGowan Center's Facebook page, and everybody have, I think, a good night.
Thank you very much.
Everybody.